Hello, and welcome to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. When we talk about Florence, we put a lot of emphasis on the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, so much so that one historian termed what came after as the forgotten centuries. But imagine being in the city in the late 16th or early 17th century. You could have bumped into Galileo Galilei or Artemisia Gentileschi on the street, their explorations in science and the arts supported by the interests of Medici Grand Dukes, their wives and their courtiers. Before 1603, you could have also bumped into Santi di Tito, like Artemisia, a member of Florence's Accademia del Disegno, and one of the early artists to adopt a proto-baroque style that's sometimes seen as a rejection of Mannerism. In this episode, Limelight's Nick Gordon sits down with artist and art historian Dominique Millar to take a closer look at Santi di Tito's Holy Family, now in Ajaccio's Musée Fesch.
Good morning, Dominique. How are you?
Very good. Thank you, Nick.
So this morning we were talking about the artist Santi di Tito, who is much less well known than many of his contemporaries, as well as artists in Florence from a slightly earlier period. Would you mind perhaps starting with walking us through the painting we'll be looking at by Santi di Tito?
Sure. So this is a Holy Family. In one sense, it's a very typical subject matter for all throughout the Renaissance. What's interesting about this painting is in the Fesch Museum in Ajaccio in Corsica. It's undated, which is interesting, and in a way that probably tells you a lot about the artist, the fact that he's quite unknown. It probably dates anywhere between circa 1560s and 1590s, and a lot of these Holy Family subjects look quite similar. The painting's based not from the Gospels; it's not a direct narrative from the New Testament, but it's actually from what's called pseudo-Bonaventure. Bonaventure was a Franciscan theologian who also wrote devotional works, and in the late Middle Ages, a lot of the texts that he wrote became associated with devotional works of the time. This story that is from this text is in relation, kind of connected to the Gospel of Matthew, where following the massacre of the innocents who were all killed by Herod, and an angel tells the Holy Family to move to Egypt. On their way back, according to Pseudo-Bonaventure, the infant Christ and the Virgin Mary and Joseph meet up with Elizabeth and the young infant John the Baptist. So that's what we see in this picture. And we have John the Baptist holding a little cup. That's the cup for baptizing. We're not dealing here with full immersion. We're dealing with baptism as it emerged in around the 2nd century of the Common Era, where we start to sprinkle people over the head with water. In the young John the Baptist's hands, he holds a cross, because in the Gospel of John he has said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." He's wearing a camel skin. We're told in the Gospels that he lived on wild honey and ate locusts and wore a camel skin and lived out in the wilderness. And in a way, this is probably set in a kind of wilderness setting. It's not particularly obvious in the painting. But he's handing his bowl to the young infant Christ, who sort of sits in a kind of cruciform position, a bit like someone on the cross. And a lot of these depictions of the Holy Family, they're very much premonitions of the Passion of Christ. In this instance, probably even just prior to the Passion, the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he says to his Father, "Take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done." And so in a way, John the Baptist is sort of standing in for often an angel you'll see in paintings handing him a cup, the cup of the suffering of the cross. And then we have Joseph, who is not integral to the salvation story, asleep, much as the Jesus' main disciples fall asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane. So the whole painting really functions as a kind of premonition of the passion of Christ to come.
And the wonderful way that you've brought out the different double meanings of many of the objects and the shapes, the positioning of the figures and who's standing in for who or what in this moment, and how that kind of also refers to events later on in the life of Christ. So you have this kind of wonderful play between what we can see, but then what people would be able to understand while looking at a devotional work like this.
Yes, indeed, and that sort of really shows how it is a devotional work. I mean, we can also see the cloth that the Virgin holds, which is a premonition, obviously, for his entombment as well. So yeah, all these things in many respects are quite conventional on one level, but at another level, this painting is really connected to a massive change in the art of Florence in the mid to late 16th century. And a lot of it is connected to a movement that was occurring in Florence that's sort of been in a way downplayed by both historians and art historians of the period. And a lot of this goes back to the Risorgimento period in the Italian 19th century, this period of unification, where historians such as Francis de Sanctis were really started to view the art sort of after Raphael, we could also say after the sack of Rome, these sort of really as kind of significant events that had caused a kind of end to the Renaissance. I mean, it's kind of interesting. Can you say the Renaissance ended at a specific date?
Yes, so there's that kind of way of trying to create a sense of decline in the 19th century, saying, well,
that's right.
A period of decline, and then there was a later movement, and that seems to be kind of erase what a whole century of artists were doing in Florence.
Well, in a way, in the 19th century, there's really this belief, and what it's really coming out of, it's coming out of Northern European German scholarship, and a lot of these historians, who are also often very politically involved in the period, they borrowed from people like Hegel, this sort of epical kind of view of history, and in that sort of line of thinking, if the Renaissance had ended at a sort of specific time around sort of circa 1520s, you get in Florence the emergence of Medici ducal rule. You tend to find in the 19th century they like to conflate Republican Florence with democratic republics in the 19th century, which is completely erroneous. But what it does is it means you can justify the fact that Italy appears to be more culturally backward in the kind of modern sense than other parts of Europe, such as Germany, France, England, etc. So this narrative is really buying into that. Unfortunately, what we find with that is then, Mannerist art, the artists of the 1530s, 1540s, and right up until circa 1600 are sort of written off as being kind of decadent. We find pretty much all Italian art after that is sort of seen as a kind of bastardization of the Italian Renaissance. What then happens in around sort of circa 1880, we start to get a revived interest in Baroque art, which comes to its full flourishing with scholars like Wittkower, their sort of rehabilitation of Baroque sculpture, architecture and painting. That finally comes to its full fruition with probably the exhibition of Caravaggio, a very famous one that happened in the 1950s, restores his reputation. Then we have with European modernism and with the particularly German expressionism, this sort of interest in people who'd come back from war, who were kind of disfigured, that starts to affect avant-garde painters of the time. And people then start looking at the sort of more distorted forms in Mannerism, and that there's an interest in that.
And also the colours they're using as well, kind of colours that are a little bit more than livid, colours that kind of...
acidic greens and sort of very strong reds, etc., sort of hot reds, hot pinks. Yes. But what sort of happens, it's the period in between, if you like, what the so-called Baroque and Mannerism, this period from about circa 1550 to circa 1600, that sort of still is viewed as sort of backward, this sort of, this is the period of the Counter-Reformation. And in a weird way, it sort of still sticks now. We have a scholar named Eric Cochrane who, in terms of the history of Italy, really questions that. He writes a book called Florence in the Forgotten Centuries. But when it comes, in a way, art history is never quite caught up. So we have Bernard Berenson, the art historian of the early 20th century, saying, after Bronzino, there's nothing of cultural worth in Florence.
That's a big call.
A big call. But then if we look at the rest of Italy, if we go to Venice, the artist who dominates Venice by far in the late 16th, early 17th century is Parma il Giovanni. church after church is full of his paintings. Whoever talks about him, if you're outside of Venice, literally no one. We have the same in other parts of the Italian peninsula. So there's still this tendency to kind of downplay this period. But what I think needs to be emphasised, and a few scholars have started to do so, is what a revolution this period was. So the possible teacher of Santi di Tito, who came originally from San Sepolcro when he moved to Florence, may have been Bronzino. And Bronzino, if we look at his work, we can see, for example, his painting of the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, which is a Roman Christian saint who was killed on a gridiron. Well, if you see his picture of that in San Lorenzo in Florence, it sort of looks like my local gym. There's sort of these sort of balletic men all in these distorted, bizarre poses. And really, the world that Santi di Tito was born into is a world from about the 1520s to the 1560s where iconoclasm is sort of rampant, particularly in France, the Low Countries and Germany. We're having paintings and images smashed and destroyed very violently. So if you can imagine a world where, say, a painting of the Madonna where your children, maybe, and your family for generations have been christened, it's kind of our Madonna, and then she is violently taken down and smashed. Imagine the cultural effect on people. And so this starts to raise questions in people's minds about sort of the importance of imagery. And at the same time, we start getting an interest in Aristotle, particularly his work on the Poetics, which talks about the importance of the legibility, the legibility of paintings and works of art. And out of that, Santi di Tito and people like that start to react against this sort of Mannerist tendency to sort of conflate painting as being showing off your sort of skills, your sort of, I mentioned in the last talk, sort of sprezzatura for sprezzatura's sake, sort of gracefulness as an end in itself, and really focus on legibility. So we sort of see this very pared down image as we see in this Madonna here. There's nothing particularly flamboyant about it. It's very naturalistic. It sort of mirrors the grace and the decorum we might associate with earlier artists such as Raphael. And then in Florence, certainly Andrea del Sarto is another example.
Yeah, and you can see it as well with that sort of kind of the influence of, say, the direction that the Council of Trent is taking with religious art to try and remove the extraneous, and that kind of push to have artists create works that allow a viewer to enter the moment or feel like they're inside. They're not kind of looking around to figure out what the painting's about. They need to struggle to identify who the figures are shown.
Very much so.
There's no extraneous saints here. It's just what needs to be there.
It's just what needs to be there. And in a way, I think that the thing about Santi di Tito, and in a sense, the appeal is probably he's not an artist that shouts at you. He's not like Caravaggio. It's not about the drama doesn't overtly scream at you. In a way, perhaps a bit like Raphael, or even going back to the Quattrocento. In fact, a painter who greatly influenced him and those of his contemporaries was an artist named Rodolfo Ghirlandaio, who was the son of the more famous Domenico Ghirlandaio. And he draws upon Raphael and all the great artists of the so-called High Renaissance, but he also sort of keeps one foot back in the Quattrocento, that sort of simplicity. And in a way, probably for people who some people find, the rhetorical overtness of Mannerism or the later Baroque of the 17th century, sort of screaming them in the face, sometimes these sort of more kind of calmer, perhaps even sometimes more austere painters can sort of be more relatable. If you're a person who's looking for sort of quiet reflection, these pictures sort of kind of in a paradoxically loud way sort of overtly kind of yell that in a sense.
Yes, and there is something contemplative in the image, in the way, for example, that none of the figures are looking out, making eye contact with the viewer as another way of drawing us into the image rather than it dragging us into it, kicking and screaming perhaps. And as you started with as well, with the number of premonitions that are contained within the objects, within the people, within their postures, as well as drawing us quietly into into a contemplative relationship with the painting. Just looking at it as well, compared to, say, some of the Mannerists that you've mentioned, there also seems to be within the work a stillness and an appreciation, perhaps, of line and composition that's different from Mannerism.
Definitely. And I think what's sort of happening, again, kind of going back to that influence of Aristotle on thinking, we have people like the humanist scholar Benedetto Vacchi, who's been studying in Padua and working there. And he comes back to Florence and sort of pushes this idea of clarity in the arts, all across the arts, whether it's poetry, whether it's theatre, etc. And it sort of affects the way they approach drawing, these sort of contra maniera painters. They start to, where, if you like, Mannerist artists had this sense of, in a kind of Platonic sense of the idea sort of coming into your mind as a sort of direct expression of sort of abstract perfection, a kind of Platonic abstract perfection. What they find is they kind of empirically look at the everyday. They're not just going to the Accademia del Disegno. This is the academy where artists went to draw from the model. They're drawing everyday people on the street. They're drawing their wives. They're drawing their cat. Goldinucci, the great kind of Vasari of the 17th century, describes Santi di Tito as drawing everything, including his cat. And it's sort of what they're doing is, Aristotle actually says, he also believes in forms like Plato, but he says they're embedded in nature. And this is the difference. This is the subtle difference. They're looking for this sort of perfection by finding it embedded in nature. They're not sort of coming with an abstraction in the way that previous artists like Bronzino and Pontormo are. They're sort of believing that in the idiosyncrasies of the natural world, they can draw out this kind of ideal. So it's a slightly different perspective, yeah.
But that will also make sense of what you start seeing in this period, but also after Santi di Tito, you also start seeing kind of renewed interest in Florence in other genres like still life, for example.
Yes, yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. So one of the artists who's connected with him is an artist named Jacopo da Empoli, and he produces these absolutely spectacular still lifes, probably, as far as I'm aware, the first still life painter of Florence. Like, we so associated Florence with, particularly from the 16th century on, with the human figure and the body. But I think that's an interesting thing. Because of this empirical interest, it kind of lends itself, and you often find in these painters, the objects can kind of almost resemble still lives, even if they're in a religious work of art. There might be, I can think of an Annunciation by Jacopo da Empoli, beautiful painting, and then in the foreground there's a vase of flowers, and it's just beautifully painted. It could almost stepped out of a Dutch still life. So it's a kind of interesting thing, and I think what's fascinating, it's an area that is sort of insufficiently explored. It's this empirical interest in the observed world, and the belief that an interest which will link in with Galileo and science, actually. So out of this idea for clarity, we get attitudes to painting and sculpture. Painting is, in a way, wins out in that kind of, can seem a rather bizarre argument between which is the superior painting or sculpture. But in the period, it's all linked to these concerns about the legibility of art. And in a way, painting sort of wins out. And there's an amazing story where Galileo describes looking through his telescope. And we know that when he looked through and saw the craters on the moon, and he was friends with these contra maniera painters, he said that it was his study of chiaroscuro. So he'd actually studied light and shadow at the Accademia del Disegno, which also functioned as a kind of almost TAFE, if you like, so people who weren't artists who could go and study there. And he says that, in a way, by observing the moon, it was akin to realizing that painting was superior to sculpture. Yes, the moon was this physical object, but it was the way light hit the moon, as would be described by a painter, that showed him, revealed to him its beauty. So it's a kind of, in an interesting way, even though we think of Galileo as someone who reacted against Aristotle in a weird kind of way, there's also this empirical side coming from Aristotle that Galileo in the cultural sphere is linked in with as well.
And of course, I think points to just how fascinating this period is in Florence. That what you're bringing out is that it's not just a stylistic change, but there's a broader philosophical change that affects the arts, that affects the sciences, that changes the way people are looking and experiencing not only art, but also how they come to, in the case of Galileo, how they come to appreciate the beauty of the natural world, even while figuring out its mechanics at the same time. And it's interesting that the Academy of Design had that role in Florence, that it was allowing non-artists.
Oh, it's absolutely fascinating. In fact, that whole academy, they were still teaching mathematics on a far more practical level, and that in itself, interest in spatial things, a linear perspective. Galileo uses that for a lot of his engineering projects for the Medici to do with warfare, etc. So there's it's a whole different world, and in a way, much like anatomy in the previous generation or in the early 16th century or late 1400s had prefigured anatomy in the sciences, we find that very much in the mid to late 16th century as well.
Wow. Well, thank you very, very much for bringing this work to our attention, as well as this period of Italian art history that is neglected, and I think we can safely say it's sort of unfairly neglected. So
indeed, Nick, indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.